Hello, my name is Dr. Jan Janechka. I'm a associate professor at Duquesne University, and today I wanted to record a relatively brief video about importing data into RStudio and just some tips that hopefully will help you do that. A little bit of advice that basically addresses some of the common errors that I have seen, especially for individuals who have recently started working with R. R again is a fantastic environment to do data analysis on. However, it has some nuances that basically are a little bit different than a lot of the canned programs like Excel and that you have to be aware of. Okay, and so one of the most important things that you need to be aware of is that in RStudio and in R, there's a difference between opening files and importing data. And so we're going to discuss this through what I hope will be a relatively short video. And I'm going to try to keep it concise. So I'm going to start off with downloading a text file that's a table that has some information on the human genome, such as chromosome length, number of genes, and different types of genes in the different chromosomes. And so I'm going to grab this as an example for a class that I teach, a bioinformatics course. And so a lot of times you're going to be downloading things from the web, right? Because there's so many different repositories there. A lot of people share their data through web pages. And so the best way to do this, and so here's an example. We're going to download again this file human-genome-info-clean-period text. And what the best way to do it is to right click it and then save link as. So basically you want to download the file without the web browser or without some other program that you have on the computer actually opening it. You just want to do a straight download, okay? So I'm going to download it to the, let's see, little folder I created on importing data files in R. And this is going to focus on just a tab delimited text file, okay? I'm going to save it. Okay, and then we're going to go to the next step. So now we're going to go to RStudio, okay? So I'm not going to go into the structure of RStudio. There's excellent tutorials on the RStudio website. They have really nice webinars introducing the RStudio platform and environment. And again, RStudio is basically a way to access R, right? So they put together a really, really nice interface that you can basically use. It's very user-friendly, and whenever you do something in RStudio, it basically sends the commands to R, and then it helps you display them and helps you write scripts and functions. Okay. So when we open up this RStudio, first thing you want to do is you want to navigate to the folder where you downloaded that text file that you're going to import, right? And so the best way to do it is you go to Session, and you need to set your working directory to the location of that file. So we're going to go Session, Set Working Directory, choose Directory, and then I'm going to go into the directory where again I downloaded that file. Okay, it opened. Now, if you look at that lower right hand panel, you see that the Explorer for the files has been adjusted to actually show the contents of the working directory, okay? What I want to point out is that one of the most common mistakes that I see when people have trouble importing data into R is that they're actually, downloading the file and they're trying to access it in a place where it's not located, right? Something very simple. A really easy fix for that. All right. So notice that when you go through the menu and you set the working directory, it basically sends a command in the console to R. So the actual function for setting the working directory is set wd and then parentheses. Okay. Now I also want to highlight that whenever you want to change the way that the function is working or just to see what options there are, you can really easily access the help files by simply writing the question in the console question mark and then the name of the function. So if we write set wd, hit enter, notice in the lower right hand panel the help page comes up for that actual function. and it goes through basically a description of what that function does, and then various different options there can be for a particular function, right? So set working directory is very simple. There's not much to it, so it doesn't have a very long help file, right? Okay, I'm going to look at my notes real quick. What other thing I want to cover? So, download, set the working directory. Another thing, make sure that the name that you have of the file is actually what you call it in any script or any kind of tutorial, or the command that you're actually using, right? That's really important, because one of the really critical things is that you got to be aware that R is extremely explicit, right? So basically it's very case sensitive, and it is also syntax specific, right? So if you have any kind of typos in there, spaces that shouldn't be there, dashes that shouldn't be there, periods, if your different words in the name are separated by dashes and yours and underscores, it's not going to find the file, right? So you got to make sure that the name of the file matches exactly what you're using in a particular function or in a particular script, or if you're following a tutorial, that's in the tutorial, right? Because sometimes what happens is when you download a file, right, depending on your operating system, the web browser, occasionally these actual programs will change the name of the file, right? So I'm trying to get to the folder where this file is located. Right, so again, I have it Untitled Genomics, importing text files. So a lot of times what happens, as I said, is that I shouldn't say a lot of times, occasionally what happens is that when you download a file, the name's changed, or you download it twice, and the file gets that parentheses and then the number, and sometimes it's even corrupted. We'll talk a little bit about this a little later. But basically, in order to check the file name, right, all you have to do is go to the file in the directory, right click, you can open it up and just to see, make sure that the contents is what you think it is going to be. But you right click it, hit properties, and then you can see the full name, right? So make sure that this full name matches what you think it matches, that it's a plain text document. And of course, it depends on what sort of function you're using to import the data file in R, right? So we're going to use a function that imports plain text files that are tab delimited, right? So we want a plain text document, right? So double check that. Also, make sure that your Explorer is actually showing you file extensions. Now, Linux systems, this is an Ubuntu operating system, right? So in Linux, pretty much it's always showing file extensions like .txt. However, often the default for Windows and Mac programs is to not show extensions, right? And so if one of the common problems that I've seen students run into and colleagues run into that can't import a file is that they have the folder set to not show extensions, then they add the extension txt, right, because they want it to have txt, and when they look at the file properties, it turns out that the file name is actually file example .txt, right? And if they then look through the properties and the actual name of the file, they'll see that there's an extra .txt, which makes it it causes an error basically, because the name of the file doesn't match what you have in a particular function that you're trying to enter, right? And so if you set your Explorer to show extensions, then you'll never have that problem. You'll make sure that you don't have the a file name that doesn't match what you're trying to enter, right? And so if you don't know how to set the Explorer to show extensions, just do a quick Google search. It's going to come up. You'll find easy directions for both Mac and for Windows systems. Okay, so let's get back into R. I'm going to again look at my notes that I write-up for this, so I'm not sure why. Here we go. That thing was sent in the back. Okay, so we went to the 3, make sure the name is the same as it appears on the script, make sure it's not .txt, look through the properties, set your folder, explore to see extensions, we talked about that. And then, okay, so if you're still having problems, right, so with importing, okay, there's 2 common issues that I've seen come up, right? First, again, when you try to download the file, okay, what ends up happening is whatever program you're using to download it either changes the format of the file, or sometimes I've also seen it throw in just like a bunch of extra characters, and I don't really have a good explanation for it. I'm sure there's an explanation for it, but I don't know why it does that, right? And so basically you need to check 2 things. Make sure it's a real text file, and make sure there isn't any extra characters that basically aren't being recognized or are corrupting the file when you're trying to import it into R, okay? So to do that, you can do 2 things. First, all you have to do is, again, go to that folder where you imported it, and then just open it up with a, some sort of text editor. So Featherpad is the kind of like the text edit notepad equivalent to the Linux system I'm using. So if you open it in Featherpad, you'll see, okay, this file here, it's a table. There's a column of, CHR, which stands for chromosome, column for the name of the chromosome. That CHR is a type of DNA molecule, basically. There's a column for the RefSeq accession number, and so forth. There's some columns for, again, the size of the chromosome, various information like the GC percentage and a number of different types of genes, right? So you want to make sure that the structure of that file you're importing matches what you expect to import, right? Now, if the file is really huge, like you have some kind of huge genomic file, like some big VCF file, you might not be able to open it up in text editor, but there are some other programs that you can open that basically show just the top or the bottom of the file, right? But we're not going to discuss those. We're kind of focusing on just importing smaller data files, right? That's a simple table, right? If everything looks normal in a text editor, right, then you can go ahead and close it. And the other thing you can check, again, is sometimes there's actually hidden characters in files that you don't recognize, right? And you won't really see if you look at it as a plain text document occasionally, right? So one way to double check it is actually open up in Word. And so in Linux, the equivalent to Word is the LibreOffice Writer. Open that up, and then I'm going to have it show all characters, right? So this show all characters, again, is going to show you all the hidden characters in that data file, right? Now, of course, because this is a table that scrolls past the page, the format is a little harder to read as a Word file when you open it, but basically what you see from the beginning of the top line, so from the T to the first hard return, would be everything that's in a line, right, that I just highlighted. Notice that it just has text, right? It has some letters and numbers, basically. Well, in the top line is just letters because it's just the names of each of the columns, right? And in between, that little arrow represents a tab, right? So this is a tab delimited table, right? It only has either letters, numbers, tabs, or hard returns, so there's no extra characters. And if you see any extra characters at the beginning or end of the file, just delete them, and then go ahead and resave the file. And to do that, make sure you don't actually save it as a Word file, right, or an ODT file if it's Linux system, right? So just go to File, Save As, and make sure that you save it as a .text file, right? And so I'm not going to save this again because there was nothing unusual about this particular file, right? And so that's just a quick way to check that, to make sure that when you downloaded something or somebody sent you a file, that they didn't actually, or the way you were trying to initially view it, it didn't again introduce some characters that's hanging up RStudio, right? Simplest way to open up a file, or I should say import a data file into R, is to go to File, and again I'm talking about basically tables that are tab delimited and they're text files, is you go to File, Import Data Set from Text Base. Alright, then when you select that file, you're going to get a Import Data Set window. And that's going to give you several different options, right, of how to actually look at the file and how that file is structured, right? So in the very first top left little window, you'll see the name. And so this is the name of the object and the data frame that's going to be created when you import it in R. And you can modify this if you want. So obviously this comes from the actual name of the file, right? To the left, or I'm sorry, to the right, you're going to see what the input file looks like. And again, you'll see that this is a tab delimited text file, right? And so just kind of scroll over and make sure that the structure of that input file is what you expect it to be, right? So this is one of the things in RStudio and in R, just like with everything else, you basically need to know a little bit about what you're trying to import to actually import it, right? Because there's different functions to import different data formats, and you have to have some kind of clue of what you're trying to import to use the correct approach to actually getting it into R, right? So the input file should match what you expect, right? Again, this is a tab delimited table. And then in the bottom right, you'll see that it shows the structure of the data frame that's going to be created when that file is imported, right? So when you import a text file into R, it's going to create a data frame that's going to allow you to then analyze the information that is in that data file. And so what basically happens is that each of these columns becomes a vector, right? And each of the vectors has a specific name, which is going to be the name of the column, right? And then a vector is basically just a series of numbers or some sort of objects that basically is to keep it simple in terms of this text. It's going to be either a series of names, categories, or numbers that is a certain piece of the data that you're importing, right? So for example, the size column is going to create a vector called size, and each of those bins is going to have an integer that is the number of base pairs of a particular chromosome in megabases, right? So the first chromosome in the human genome is 248.96 million base pairs, right? Okay, now notice that this particular function for importing the data does have some variables that you can actually, and parameters you can change, right? So, encoding is automatic, or there's different kind of encoding types. You can tell whether or not there's a heading in the file. So basically heading would be whether there's a name for each of the columns or not, right? So notice if you go no, then it just has V1, V2, V3, V4. This is just the generic name of of the columns. In R, notice that it's going to make the first row, which are supposed to be the name of the columns, is going to make them into the data in that column. So you don't want that. So we do have headings in this particular file. There's whether or not there's actually names for the different rows, right? You can leave that as automatically recognize it. There's also a parameter where you can change whether or not the columns are separated by a tab or semicolon, comma, or a space. We can see whether there's periods and decimal places, whether there's quotes in there, comments, etc. And then NA strings is also important because NA strings means how do you code missing data, right? So this is important too, because every single data file can have actually different ways of coding missing data, and if you don't match the NA strings parameter with how the missing data is coded in the actual file, right, it's going to be read, the missing data is going to be read actually as a data point, right? So a good example is in the very well-known population genetics program structure, they code missing data with a -9, right? And if you were basically to have the missing data in this import function for that particular data type listed as NA, then it would use -9 as literally a data point, right? -9. It wouldn't use it as missing data. So again, that obviously is going to completely screw up any kind of statistics that you're doing on your columns, right? And then this check here, strings as factors, that is basically a parameter or variable that is going to import any kind of text that you have in a column as a categorical value, okay? And so for this particular table, we can actually leave everything as default and hit import, right? Now notice when we run the import function, it does three things, right? It actually creates a object, so it's right here, is human.genome.info.clean. The name of the object matches the data frame, right? So the data frame becomes an object in R. That's done through this assignment operator. And then this function read.delim is actually ran, and all the basically stuff that's pulled from this file has been dumped into the data frame, right? That's appears here in the global environment under data, right? And also the next thing that happens is that there's a function view that's ran in the console, and that opens up this data viewer that you see on the upper left window, right? And so this data viewer basically shows you what the data appears like, right? And so before you do any kind of analysis, you want to make sure that the data that you imported has the structure and contents of what you expect it to be, right? So again, this is what I had said, is you can't just start importing things without actually knowing what you're doing. So RStudio is a wonderful program, but it basically takes more directed attention than something like Excel. With Excel, a lot of times you just open up an Excel file and you may not even know what's in there, right? In R, for you to import the data, you actually have to know a little bit about the structure of the file and the data you're trying to import to actually import it into RStudio, right? Now, I'm going to also show you right now the difference between opening a data file and importing a data file. So what we just did is we imported the data into R. That's going to allow you to perform data analysis on these 12 variables which have 24 observations, right? If we click on the lower right hand of the data, the down arrow, it's going to show you some information on each of the columns, right? And so now you can basically do some sort of statistical analysis on that information. Now, in contrast, if we were to open the data file, which you can do in R, right? So if we go to File, and we go to Open File, and we open the genome, the same thing we just imported, okay? Notice what happens, right? It opens up the file, right? But it opens it up just like any text editor would open it up, right? And so you can see the name of the file has the dashes separating the words in the name, and it's .txt. So when you open a data file in R, right, or I'm sorry, in RStudio, what it's doing is it's opening up like a text editor. It's showing you the contents of that file, right? And you can't do anything with it. You can't do any kind of analysis with it. In contrast, when you import it, okay, when you import data, it creates a data frame that appears in the data panel in the global environment. It shows the viewer if again that view function was ran at the same time that you imported it, and it allows you to actually perform data analysis on the data that you imported, right? So this is a big difference. And so again, that's one of the things that people are, when they're learning how to use R, that's one thing that they kind of get hung up on, is that they don't differentiate the difference between opening a file and importing a data file, right? I'm going to check my notes real quick if there's any last thing that I wanted to show. So I didn't need to show that one. This is, let's see. Okay, so the other thing I want to mention is that if for some reason you still can't download the file, okay, um, you having trouble downloading for whatever reason, a kind of quick solution to do it is go ahead and open up the text file in HTML, right? And then just copy it and paste it, because if you have that text file, if it opens up in HTML and you copy the text, it really should only be copying the text over, right? So what you can do is you can go ahead and open up a text editor. So again, I'm using Feather Pad, right? Create a open file, and then just copy paste it into that text file, right? So notice again the columns this looks identical, right? And then you can save it as a text file, right? I'm gonna name it the same thing, but I'm just gonna call it C and P as copy and paste it, but I'm only gonna use dashes CP. Okay, I'll choose just CP. All right, I'm gonna save it, and so now notice when I import this one, let's see, and I'm gonna close that tab. I'm gonna close all the tabs. I don't really need them. Now when I import the file I created just by copying pasting the text from the HTML page, right? It should work the same way, right? So I'm opening it, structure's the same, and now it's imported, right? And so now we have again the viewer shows the same contents. So I basically got to the same result. I just copied pasted from the HTML into a text editor and then save it as a text file, right? So if for some reason you're having trouble downloading it without the web browser opening it, that's just another option to do it, right? Now the reason that that text file I just saved does not show up in that folder right here, and again, directory and folder are synonymous, right? So directory is what we call folders in R. If you hit the refresh button, it's going to show up, right? So notice it refresh, it shows up. The very last thing I want to tell you is that when you have, you're going to potentially be working with lots of different kinds of data, right? And so, for example, sequencing data, if we're working with it, we're importing FASTA files, VCF files, various other types of data formats. And so often what happens is you sometimes have to find the specific library that can actually import and has the import function for that particular data format that you can actually or that you need to use, right? So again, in order for you to work with data in RStudio, you have to know something about what you're trying to import. You at least have to know what sort of format it is, and again, make sure that you are aware of what you're trying to do, right? So make sure that you know what to expect, and the overall structure, how many observations there are roughly, how many variables are supposed to be in the table, because when you import it, again, you got to make sure that it got imported correctly before you do any kind of statistical analysis, right? And again, keep in mind that you have the working directory set, and that you pay particular attention to how missing data is coded, especially in a large data file that you may not be able to view the whole table, right? The very last thing that I'm going to end it on is that when you are working in an R session, right, and you execute a bunch of functions, right, and then you close that R session and you open up a new one like a couple days later, what happens is that data frame that you imported is no longer going to be in the global environment, right? And so when you want to jump back exactly where you were and you start entering functions, like the objects that you created in the previous session are not going to be there, and ours is going to throw you an error, right? When you try to run some function on the data frame, that data in your new session is not going to be in the global environment. Most likely it's not going to be in the data part of the global environment. And so all you have to do is you got to make sure that, again, you're saving all your functions in a script, right, or in a text document. Best is in a script, of course. and that when you create a new session, you just re-import the data, and that you also create the objects by running those lines of code that you need to perform the rest of the analysis. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there. I hope that you found this useful. And again, I try to just cover some of the basic mistakes that I have seen for folks that have recently started R and RStudio, and some of it isn't for new people. I mean, I sometimes, I use RStudio sporadically, and so I might use it a lot and then not touch it for 3-4 months, and a lot of times I'll forget, and I'll get errors, and I've tried to import files, and I'm like, what's going on? And then I'm like, oh shoot, the particular, this happened to me teaching class, right? I was showing an R script, and I had set on the PC that is at the lectern, I set the Explorer to show file extensions, right? And they updated the system, and of course, that setting I had in there got changed to default, which is do not show extensions. And when I tried to run the script, I had wrote .txt, and so again the file was named .txt, and I spent like 5 minutes messing around with it in front of the whole class, not realizing that the file didn't have the right name, because again they updated the system and they changed the folder to no longer show extension. So when I added that .txt extension, it was really labeled .txt, and so my script was throwing an error because it couldn't find the input file, right? So, and a lot of times when you have an error, make sure that you read the error, see what it's telling you, and then do either a search through the help files, or search through the online, different help communities, and also just general things that information posts that can help you figure out what's actually going on. So I hope again that you got some information out of this, and that you are going to be able to import files and start working with data in this wonderful environment. Thank you.